What if the biggest thing holding you back is not a lack of ability, but your habit of avoiding what feels uncomfortable? You know what needs to be done, yet you delay, check your phone, choose easier tasks, or wait for motivation. Then the day ends, and you feel the weight of another promise you did not keep. This audiobook will help you understand why that happens and what you can do about it. You will learn how to separate temporary discomfort from real problems, build simple routines, protect your attention, start difficult tasks without endless preparation, and stay consistent when motivation disappears. You will also discover how to manage strong emotions, tolerate boredom, protect long-term goals, and build an identity based on personal responsibility. If you want practical guidance for becoming more disciplined, subscribe to the channel and stay until the end. Your next decision may be the one that changes how you approach every difficult responsibility. Chapter 1. Identify the real reasons you resist difficult tasks and responsibilities. Most people do not struggle with difficult tasks because they are incapable of doing them. They struggle because some part of them has learned to avoid the discomfort that comes before action. You know the experience. You have something important to finish, but instead of beginning, you check your phone, make another cup of coffee, organize something that was already organized, or tell yourself you will start when you feel more prepared. The task remains exactly where it was, yet you feel temporarily better because you have escaped the pressure of facing it. That temporary relief is easy to misunderstand. It can feel like rest, but often it is avoidance. And when avoidance becomes a repeated response, the real problem is no longer the task itself. The problem becomes your relationship with discomfort. Before you can develop the discipline to do what you do not want to do, you need to understand what you are actually resisting. Sometimes you are resisting effort. Sometimes you are resisting uncertainty. Sometimes you are afraid of failing, being judged, discovering that you are not as capable as you hoped, or losing the freedom to do something more enjoyable. There are also tasks that carry emotional weight because they force you to confront responsibilities you would rather postpone. Paying a neglected bill, making an uncomfortable phone call, applying for a better job, exercising after a long period of inactivity, or having an honest conversation can all create resistance for reasons that have little to do with physical difficulty. The first act of discipline, therefore, is not forcing yourself forward blindly. It is becoming honest about what your mind is trying to avoid. Consider someone who repeatedly delays an important project at work. From the outside, it may look like laziness, but when that person examines the situation carefully, a different explanation may appear. Perhaps the project matters enough that failure would feel embarrassing. Perhaps the instructions are unclear, so beginning creates anxiety. Perhaps previous criticism has made the person cautious about making mistakes. The mind then searches for an easier activity because easy activities provide immediate certainty. Checking email feels productive without requiring meaningful exposure to failure. Rearranging files feels responsible without demanding a difficult decision. The person may spend hours working while avoiding the one action that actually matters. This is why discipline requires more than telling yourself to work harder. You have to recognize the hidden reward your avoidance is giving you. Avoidance usually offers something immediately attractive. It reduces tension. It protects your current comfort. It allows you to postpone an unpleasant emotion. But the cost appears later. A task that could have taken 30 minutes becomes a source of worry throughout the entire day. A conversation that could have cleared up a misunderstanding becomes more difficult after weeks of silence. A small financial problem becomes larger because it was repeatedly ignored. The emotional cost grows because you are carrying both the original responsibility and the knowledge that you have not dealt with it. This creates a cycle that can quietly weaken self-respect. Every time you escape something you know you should face, you teach yourself that discomfort is a sufficient reason to retreat. That does not mean every form of resistance should be defeated immediately. Sometimes resistance contains useful information. You may be exhausted because you have been working without adequate recovery. You may be pursuing a goal that no longer makes sense. You may need more information before making a decision. Discipline is not the refusal to listen to yourself. It is the ability to listen carefully without allowing every feeling to become an instruction. There is a major difference between saying, "I feel uncomfortable, so I cannot do this," and saying, "I feel uncomfortable, so I need to understand why, then decide what responsibility requires." The first response gives authority to the emotion. The second keeps authority with you. A practical way to begin is to stop using the word lazy as your explanation. The word often ends the investigation before it begins. Instead, when you notice yourself avoiding something important, ask a more precise question. What exactly am I trying not to experience? Maybe the answer is boredom. Maybe it is uncertainty. Maybe it is fear of making a poor decision. Maybe it is the frustration of being a beginner. Maybe you simply prefer immediate pleasure over delayed results. The answer matters because different forms of resistance require different responses. If the problem is uncertainty, clarify the next step. If it is boredom, create a specific work period and remove unnecessary stimulation. If it is fear of failure, define what a reasonable attempt looks like rather than demanding a perfect outcome. If it is distraction, change the environment instead of relying entirely on willpower. This becomes especially important in ordinary daily decisions. Imagine that you intend to exercise after work. At 6 o'clock, you are tired. Your mind immediately presents reasons to postpone it. You tell yourself that tomorrow will be better. But before accepting that thought, examine the actual situation. Are you physically unable to exercise, or are you simply reluctant to begin? Is the workout truly too demanding, or does the transition from comfort to effort feel unpleasant? If you are healthy enough to exercise and the plan is reasonable, then the decision becomes clearer. You do not need to manufacture enthusiasm. You only need to acknowledge the resistance and take the first responsible action. Put on the clothes, leave the room, begin with 5 minutes. Once action starts, the emotional argument often becomes much quieter. The same principle applies to responsibilities that have nothing to do with fitness. You may need to study when entertainment is more appealing. You may need to prepare tomorrow's work when you would rather sleep. You may need to tell someone the truth when avoiding the conversation feels easier. In each case, discipline begins by separating preference from responsibility. You are allowed to dislike the task. You are allowed to feel nervous, bored, frustrated, or tired. None of those feelings automatically determine what should happen next. A mature form of self-control does not demand that you enjoy every necessary action. It accepts that some valuable actions will remain unpleasant and chooses them anyway when they serve a responsibility you have consciously accepted. There is another reason this matters. Your repeated responses to small moments of resistance gradually influence what you believe about yourself. If you repeatedly finish what you begin, keep reasonable commitments, and face uncomfortable responsibilities without unnecessary delay, you develop evidence that you can trust your own decisions. If you repeatedly negotiate with every difficult task, your mind becomes accustomed to finding exceptions. The difference may seem insignificant on one afternoon, but across months it can shape your habits, your confidence, and the standards you use to evaluate your own behavior. Self-respect is strengthened less by what you intend to do than by what you consistently demonstrate through action. This is why the goal is not to eliminate resistance. Resistance will continue to appear. Even highly disciplined people have mornings when they would rather remain in bed, afternoons when concentration becomes difficult, and moments when an easier option looks more attractive. The difference is that they do not treat resistance as a final decision. They examine it, determine whether it contains legitimate information, and then act according to what matters. That process creates a form of resilience that does not depend on feeling powerful. It depends on making clear decisions while feelings are present. Tonight, or the next time you catch yourself postponing something important, pause before reaching for another distraction. Name the task, then name the feeling you are trying to escape. Ask what the task actually requires from you, and reduce the responsibility to the smallest honest action that moves it forward. Do not promise yourself an extraordinary performance. Promise yourself that you will stop hiding from the first necessary step. That small act of honesty changes the problem. You are no longer fighting an invisible force called laziness. You are confronting a specific form of resistance that can be understood and managed. Once you begin seeing resistance this way, another question becomes unavoidable. If you already know what you are avoiding and understand why it feels difficult, why do you still wait for motivation before acting? The answer leads to a deeper principle. Lasting discipline cannot depend on whether you feel ready today. It must be built into the way you structure your actions, especially when motivation is absent. Chapter 2. Separate temporary discomfort from decisions that protect your long-term goals. There are moments when doing the right thing feels wrong simply because it feels unpleasant. You know you should get out of bed, but your body wants another hour of sleep. You know you should finish the assignment, but your mind wants entertainment. You know you should save the money, but buying something now feels far more satisfying. In these moments, the difficulty is not always knowing what matters. The difficulty is judging the meaning of discomfort accurately. A tired mind can interpret effort as a warning. A frustrated mind can interpret delay as relief. An anxious mind can interpret uncertainty as a reason to stop. If you never learn to distinguish temporary discomfort from a genuine problem, you can make important decisions based on feelings that were never meant to determine your future. Your emotions are real, but they are not always reliable forecasts. Feeling uncomfortable does not prove that an action is harmful. Feeling bored does not prove that an activity is pointless. Feeling afraid does not prove that you are making the wrong decision. The mind naturally gives greater attention to immediate experiences because immediate experiences are easier to evaluate than distant consequences. A difficult workout is happening now. Better health is months away. Studying feels demanding this evening. Greater competence may not become visible until much later. Saving money requires giving up something enjoyable today, while financial stability is a future condition you cannot immediately feel. This difference between immediate experience and delayed consequence explains why intelligent people can repeatedly choose what they know will make tomorrow harder. The important question is not whether something feels difficult. The better question is whether the difficulty is temporary and proportionate to something you genuinely value. Imagine you have decided to wake early each morning to prepare for an important examination. On the fourth morning, the alarm sounds and you feel exhausted. Your first thought is that the routine is not working, but one unpleasant morning does not provide enough evidence to reject the entire decision. You need to examine the larger picture. Did you sleep poorly? Have you been following the schedule consistently? Is the study plan realistic? Are you recovering adequately? If the system is reasonable and the discomfort is simply the normal adjustment to a demanding routine, Abandoning it would confuse temporary difficulty with a permanent conclusion. This distinction becomes even more important when your emotions are strong. Anger can make immediate retaliation feel necessary. Fear can make withdrawal feel intelligent. Disappointment can make quitting feel justified. Excitement can make unnecessary spending feel harmless. In each case, the emotional experience creates pressure for an immediate decision. A disciplined person learns to create space between the feeling and the response. That space does not require suppressing emotion. It requires refusing to let a temporary internal condition make a permanent external decision. You can acknowledge, "I am angry right now," without deciding that you should send the message. You can admit, "I am discouraged," without deciding that the goal is no longer worth pursuing. This is where responsibility becomes more demanding than motivation. Motivation asks whether you feel willing to act. Responsibility asks what the situation requires from you. Those questions often produce different answers. A parent may be tired and still need to prepare for the next day. A professional may feel frustrated and still need to complete an important responsibility. A student may feel bored and still need to study. A person trying to improve their finances may want to spend money and still decide to protect a larger financial objective. None of this means ignoring legitimate limits. It means evaluating those limits rather than automatically obeying them. Discipline becomes stronger when you stop treating every unpleasant feeling as evidence that something should change. One useful practice is to ask yourself what will remain true after the feeling passes. Suppose you are considering skipping a workout because you feel unmotivated. Ask yourself whether you will still believe the decision was wise tomorrow morning. Suppose you want to abandon a difficult course because today's lesson made you feel incapable. Ask whether the same conclusion would seem reasonable after a good night's sleep and a clearer mind. Suppose you are tempted to break a commitment because following through has become inconvenient. Ask whether the inconvenience changes the value of the commitment or merely changes your mood. These questions help you evaluate decisions from a more stable position instead of allowing the emotional temperature of one moment to control the larger direction of your life. There is also a difference between pain that signals danger and discomfort that signals adaptation. If you experience serious physical pain during exercise, ignoring it is not discipline. If you are mentally overwhelmed because your schedule is unsustainable, simply demanding more effort may be irresponsible. But if you are experiencing ordinary boredom while learning, mild frustration while practicing, or reluctance before beginning a necessary task, those experiences do not automatically indicate that something is wrong. Growth often involves becoming capable of functioning while conditions are less than ideal. The goal is not to become insensitive to warning signs. The goal is to become more accurate at interpreting them. Consider someone who wants to build a habit of reading every evening. At first, the person enjoys choosing books and imagining the benefits. After several weeks, the novelty disappears. Reading begins to feel repetitive. The person starts watching short videos instead because they provide immediate stimulation. If the person concludes that reading is no longer useful simply because it has become less exciting, the decision is being driven by novelty rather than purpose. A more disciplined approach recognizes that the emotional reward has changed while the original reason for the habit remains. This is a crucial stage in any long-term commitment. When the excitement disappears, you discover whether your behavior was based on intention or emotional preference. The same principle applies to relationships and personal responsibilities. Sometimes you need to have a difficult conversation even though you would rather avoid it. The discomfort may include nervousness, embarrassment, or uncertainty about the other person's reaction. If the relationship matters, those feelings may be the price of honest communication rather than evidence that the conversation should never happen. Yet, discipline does not mean forcing every conversation. You still need judgment. Is the discussion necessary? Is your intention constructive? Is the timing appropriate? Can you communicate respectfully? By asking these questions, you prevent discomfort from becoming the deciding factor, while still allowing reason to guide the action. A powerful way to develop this judgment is to stop asking, "How do I feel about doing this?" and begin asking, "What outcome am I protecting by doing this?" The first question centers your immediate emotional experience. The second connects your action to a larger responsibility. If you study, you are protecting your future competence. If you exercise, you are protecting your physical capacity. If you save money, you are protecting future options. If you keep a difficult promise, you are protecting your reliability. When the purpose becomes clear, discomfort becomes easier to evaluate because you are no longer considering the unpleasant action in isolation. You are considering what the action makes possible. There will be times when the answer changes. Perhaps you discover that a goal was based on someone else's expectations. Perhaps the cost has become unreasonable. Perhaps new information changes the situation. Discipline should never turn stubbornness into a virtue. The ability to change course when evidence demands it is part of self-control. The difference between disciplined adjustment and emotional avoidance is the quality of the reasoning behind the decision. One says, "I have reconsidered because the facts have changed." The other says, "I want relief, so I am changing the plan." Learning to tell those two statements apart is one of the most valuable forms of personal maturity. You can practice this distinction in small situations before demanding it from yourself during major challenges. When you notice reluctance, wait briefly before acting on it. Name the discomfort without exaggerating it. Ask whether there is a genuine problem that requires correction or an ordinary feeling that will pass. Consider what your current choice protects and what it sacrifices, then make the decision deliberately. You are training yourself to become less reactive without becoming rigid. Over time, this changes the quality of your decisions because you begin evaluating temporary emotions against stable principles rather than allowing one uncomfortable moment to redefine your priorities. Eventually, you begin to understand something important about discipline. The hardest decisions are often not between right and wrong. They are between what feels better now and what you have already decided matters more. That is why long-term goals require more than clear intentions. They require structures that make the responsible choice easier to repeat when your emotional state changes. And once you recognize that your feelings cannot always be trusted to carry your commitments, another challenge appears. How do you build a daily routine that continues working even on the days when motivation disappears completely? Chapter 3. Establish simple routines that reduce dependence on daily motivation. Motivation is unreliable because it changes before your responsibilities do. One morning, you may wake up focused, energetic, and ready to work. The next morning, the same responsibility can feel strangely difficult even though nothing important has changed. If your ability to act depends on feeling motivated, your behavior will naturally become inconsistent. You will work intensely when your mood supports you and negotiate with yourself when it does not. Over time, this creates an exhausting pattern in which every important task requires another internal debate. The solution is not to become permanently motivated. It is to make fewer decisions about whether you will act. A simple routine can do something motivation cannot. It can establish what happens next before your emotions begin negotiating with you. Human attention is strongly influenced by novelty and immediate reward. When an activity is new, the mind often gives it more attention because the outcome feels uncertain and interesting. Repetition changes that experience. The same study session, workout, writing period, or morning preparation eventually becomes ordinary. This is where many people mistakenly conclude that their commitment has weakened. In reality, the emotional excitement has simply decreased. A routine becomes valuable precisely because it continues after novelty disappears. Instead of asking whether you still feel inspired, you begin following a sequence that has already been decided. The behavior becomes less dependent on emotional stimulation and more connected to a predictable structure. Imagine someone who wants to exercise consistently but makes the decision each evening after work. Every day presents a new question. Do I have enough energy? Do I feel like going? Was today stressful? Would tomorrow be better? Those questions seem reasonable, but they create unnecessary opportunities for avoidance. Now imagine the same person deciding in advance that exercise happens immediately after work on specific days, with the clothes already prepared and the workout defined before the day begins. The routine does not guarantee perfect consistency, but it removes several decisions that previously consumed mental energy. The person is no longer deciding whether exercise is part of the evening. That decision was already made. This principle can be applied to almost any responsibility. If you want to read more, choose a fixed period and location rather than waiting for free time to appear. If you need to study, decide what subject you will work on before sitting down. If you want to write, establish a regular starting time and a clear minimum session. If you want to manage your finances, schedule a specific moment each week to review spending rather than checking your accounts only when anxiety appears. The purpose is not to make your life rigid. The purpose is to move important behaviors from the category of daily negotiation into the category of established practice. There is a psychological advantage to this shift that is easy to underestimate. Every unnecessary decision has a cost. When you repeatedly ask yourself whether you should begin, what you should do first, how long you should continue, or whether today is a good day, you create opportunities for emotional reasoning to enter the process. A routine reduces those openings. It gives your attention a predetermined direction. This is especially useful when you are tired, distracted, or under pressure, because those are the moments when complicated plans are most likely to collapse. Simplicity becomes a form of self-control. But a routine should not be confused with an enormous schedule. People often respond to a desire for discipline by designing an ideal day that requires extraordinary energy. They plan early exercise, extended reading, deep work, perfect meals, extensive learning, and strict evening routines all at once. The plan may look impressive, but its complexity creates another problem. When one part fails, the entire structure can feel broken. A better approach is to establish a small number of behaviors that are clear enough to repeat even on ordinary days. The question is not, what would my most productive day look like? It is, what structure can I realistically follow when my day is difficult? Suppose you decide to write for an hour every morning, but your schedule often becomes unpredictable. You could instead create a starting ritual that takes only a few minutes. Sit at the same place, open the document, review the previous sentence, and write the first paragraph before checking messages. The ritual matters because it creates a consistent entry point. You are training your mind to associate a particular sequence with focused work. Eventually, beginning requires less psychological effort because the environment and sequence provide familiar cues. You are not depending on inspiration to tell you when to start. The environment itself can either support or undermine the routine. If your phone is beside you while you work, you are asking discipline to compete with constant opportunities for stimulation. If your running shoes are buried in a closet, you are adding friction to an activity you already find difficult to begin. If your study materials are scattered across several locations, starting requires additional decisions. Small environmental changes can therefore have significant effects. Put necessary materials where they are easy to reach. Remove distractions that serve no purpose during the activity. Prepare the next action before finishing the current session. Good routines do not rely entirely on stronger willpower. They reduce the number of obstacles that willpower has to overcome. Another important principle is to define the beginning more clearly than the ending. Many people avoid tasks because the task feels enormous in their imagination. "I need to clean the house" sounds heavier than "I will clear the kitchen counter for 10 minutes. "I need to study all evening" creates more resistance than "I will open the textbook and complete the first section." A routine becomes easier to follow when the first action is concrete. Once you begin, you can decide whether additional effort is appropriate. This does not mean pretending large responsibilities are small. It means giving your mind a specific entrance into the work instead of presenting it with an undefined demand. There will also be days when the routine must be adjusted. Discipline is not destroyed by flexibility when flexibility is deliberate. If you planned an hour of exercise but become unexpectedly busy, completing a shorter session may preserve the structure better than abandoning it completely. If your normal study period becomes impossible, moving it to another reasonable time may be more responsible than treating the day as lost. The key is to distinguish adaptation from escape. Adaptation preserves the underlying commitment while changing the method. Escape removes the commitment because following it has become inconvenient. This distinction becomes especially important after a failure. Missing one morning does not need to become an argument against the entire routine. The danger comes from turning a single disruption into a new identity. "I always fail at this," or "I can never stay consistent." Those conclusions add unnecessary emotional weight to an ordinary mistake. A disciplined response is more practical. Identify what disrupted the routine, decide whether the structure needs adjustment, and return at the next available opportunity. The objective is not to create a record without imperfections. It is to develop a system that makes returning normal. You can also make routines easier to maintain by connecting them to responsibilities you already perform. If you drink coffee every morning, that existing behavior can become the point after which you begin reading or planning the day. If you return home at a consistent time, that moment can become the beginning of exercise or household responsibilities. Existing patterns provide stable reference points, making new behaviors easier to remember. This is more reliable than hoping you will remember a new habit at an unpredictable time. The routine becomes attached to something that already happens, rather than competing with the rest of your schedule for attention. As these structures become familiar, something deeper changes. You stop needing to prove your commitment to yourself every morning. The routine begins carrying part of the responsibility. You still choose to follow it, but the choice becomes simpler because the decision has already been clarified. This creates a different kind of freedom. You have fewer internal arguments because fewer decisions are being made in the emotional moment. Instead of spending energy asking what you should do, you can spend that energy doing it well. The goal is not to turn your life into a mechanical schedule where every minute is controlled. The goal is to protect important commitments from temporary moods. A good routine should leave room for judgment, recovery, relationships, unexpected events, and genuine changes in priorities. It should make responsible behavior easier without making you incapable of adapting. The strongest structure is not the one that looks most impressive on paper. It is the one that continues functioning when your day is ordinary, inconvenient, or emotionally unremarkable. Eventually, you may notice an unexpected result. The routine begins to change not only what you do, but how much attention you spend deciding what to do. That reduction in internal negotiation creates valuable mental space. Yet, there is still a serious problem waiting ahead. Even the best routine can be disrupted by the environment around you. A notification can interrupt your concentration. An easy distraction can steal an hour. A tempting opportunity can pull your attention away from a responsibility you intended to complete. If discipline depends on a routine, then protecting that routine requires learning how to control what receives your attention in the first place. Chapter 4: Control distractions before they quietly consume your attention and energy. Your attention can disappear long before you realize you have lost it. You sit down intending to complete an important task, open your computer, and tell yourself you will stay focused. A few minutes later, you notice a message, check it quickly, see another notification, open a website, read something unrelated, and eventually find yourself doing several activities while accomplishing none of the work you originally intended. The most frustrating part is that each interruption seemed harmless. Nothing felt serious enough to stop you. Yet by the end of the day, your energy is gone and the important task remains unfinished. Distraction rarely announces itself as a major decision. It usually enters through small moments that appear too insignificant to resist. The deeper problem is not simply that there are distracting things around you. Human attention naturally moves toward information that is new, emotionally stimulating, or immediately rewarding. A notification can create curiosity before you have consciously decided to investigate it. A message can create uncertainty that your mind wants resolved. A short video can provide immediate entertainment without demanding sustained effort. An unfinished conversation can occupy your thoughts even while you are trying to work. This means that distraction is not always a failure of character. Your attention is being pulled by powerful psychological incentives, but understanding that fact does not remove your responsibility. Once you understand what is happening, you can stop treating every impulse as something that deserves your attention. Consider what happens when you receive a notification while working. The interruption may take only 10 seconds. You glance at the screen, read the message, and return to your task. It seems harmless, but the real cost is not necessarily those 10 seconds. Your mind has changed subjects. You now carry information from the message into the work. You may wonder who sent it, whether you should respond, and what the message means. Even if you ignore it, part of your attention remains attached to it. The work becomes less continuous, and restarting concentration requires effort. Repeated throughout a day, these small interruptions can produce hours of fragmented attention without any single interruption appearing responsible for the loss. This is why disciplined attention requires more than trying harder to concentrate. You need to decide what deserves access to your mind before the distractions arrive. If you know you are writing for the next hour, silence unnecessary notifications before beginning. If you are studying, place the phone somewhere that requires physical effort to retrieve. If you need to have a serious conversation, remove the television and other competing sources of stimulation. These actions may seem simple, but their importance is psychological. You are making the desired behavior easier to maintain by reducing the number of competing demands placed on your attention. There is another form of distraction that receives less attention because it does not come from a device. It comes from your own thoughts. You can be sitting in a quiet room with no notifications and still be mentally scattered. You remember an unpaid bill, replay something someone said, imagine a future conversation, worry about a decision, or suddenly decide that you need to reorganize your schedule. The mind can generate an endless series of unfinished concerns. When this happens, the solution is not to force every thought away. Instead, identify whether the thought requires action now. If it does not, record it somewhere reliable and return to the task. You are teaching yourself that every thought does not require immediate engagement. Many people also confuse availability with responsibility. Because you can respond immediately, you assume you should respond immediately. Because someone can reach you, you feel obligated to remain constantly reachable. Because information is available at any moment, you feel pressure to keep checking it. This creates a life in which your attention is continuously offered to other people's priorities. A disciplined person learns that being responsible does not mean being permanently accessible. Some responsibilities deserve immediate attention, others can wait. The ability to delay a response without anxiety is an important form of self-control because it allows you to protect commitments that require uninterrupted concentration. Think about someone working from home who receives messages throughout the morning. Each message appears to be reasonable. A coworker asks a question. A family member sends an update. A friend shares something interesting. The person answers each one because none seems important enough to ignore. By lunchtime, however, the major project has barely moved. The problem was not that any individual message was harmful. The problem was the absence of boundaries around attention. Without those boundaries, every external request competed with the responsibility that had already been accepted. The person was busy responding while becoming less effective at the work that actually required sustained thought. Distraction can also become emotional avoidance. Sometimes you reach for your phone not because you genuinely want information, but because you want relief from an uncomfortable mental state. Difficult work creates uncertainty. Boredom creates restlessness. A complicated decision creates tension. Checking something online gives you an immediate change in emotional experience. This makes distraction especially powerful because it does more than entertain you. It helps you escape. Once you recognize this pattern, the question changes. Instead of asking, "Why am I so distracted?" you can ask, "What feeling am I trying to avoid right now?" That question can reveal whether the real problem is the device in your hand or the discomfort created by the responsibility in front of you. Imagine you are preparing a difficult report and suddenly feel an urge to check social media. You could simply tell yourself not to do it, but if the urge continues, investigate it. Perhaps you are uncertain about the report's conclusion. Perhaps you are afraid that your work will be criticized. Perhaps you have reached a section that requires careful thinking, and your mind wants an easier activity. Once you recognize that, you can respond to the actual problem. Clarify the next sentence. Review the evidence. Ask for information if necessary. Take a brief planned break if you genuinely need one. The important point is that you do not use distraction to solve a problem that requires attention. Your physical environment can either reinforce or weaken this discipline. If your workspace contains multiple screens, constant alerts, entertainment within reach, and unfinished personal tasks scattered around you, concentration becomes unnecessarily difficult. You can make the environment quieter without making your life restrictive. Keep only the materials required for the current task visible. Close unrelated windows. Put your phone outside immediate reach. Decide when communication will be checked instead of allowing it to interrupt continuously. When you reduce visual and digital noise, you are not becoming less connected to the world. You are deciding when connection is appropriate. It is also useful to recognize the difference between a genuine break and passive distraction. A break has a purpose. You step away because you need to recover attention, move your body, eat, breathe, or rest your eyes. Passive distraction often has no clear stopping point. You begin checking one thing and continue because another piece of information appears. This is why breaks can become longer than intended. Without a defined boundary, the activity itself determines when you return. A disciplined break has an intentional beginning and an intentional end. You decide when recovery is complete rather than waiting for stimulation to become boring. Protecting attention also means becoming comfortable with being unreachable for short periods. At first, this can create anxiety. You may wonder whether you are missing something important. You may feel pressure to check messages simply because you have not checked them recently. But repeated periods of uninterrupted work can teach your mind that nothing catastrophic happens when you are temporarily unavailable. This creates a stronger sense of control because your attention is no longer constantly responding to external signals. You become capable of choosing when to engage instead of automatically reacting whenever something demands notice. The ultimate goal is not perfect concentration. Human beings become tired, curious, emotional, and distracted. Expecting complete control would create another unnecessary source of frustration. The goal is to notice quickly when your attention has been taken and return it deliberately. You may lose 10 minutes. You may discover that you have been reading something unrelated for half an hour. The disciplined response is not to spend another hour criticizing yourself. Close the distraction, identify what pulled you away, and resume the responsibility in front of you. Recovery speed matters because every person will lose focus at some point. As you begin controlling distractions, you may discover something uncomfortable. Some distractions were not really distractions at all. They were convenient ways of avoiding work that you already knew would demand effort. Removing your phone does not automatically make difficult work enjoyable. Closing every browser tab does not remove uncertainty. Silence does not eliminate fear of failure. Once external distractions become less available, the remaining resistance becomes easier to see. That is valuable because you can finally address the real obstacle instead of constantly treating its symptoms. Your attention is one of the clearest expressions of what you consider important. Whatever repeatedly receives your attention eventually receives a portion of your life. That makes attention a responsibility, not merely a productivity tool. When you decide what deserves your focus, you are deciding what deserves your limited time and energy. Yet controlling the environment and protecting your attention still leaves one important challenge unresolved. Even after you remove distractions and create the right conditions, you can still stand in front of the task and hesitate. The next step is learning how to move from intention into action before resistance has enough time to become another excuse. Chapter 5. Start uncomfortable tasks immediately using small, deliberate actions. The hardest part of many responsibilities is not the work itself. It is the period between knowing you should begin and actually beginning. During those few minutes, your mind can produce an impressive collection of reasons to wait. You need more time. You should prepare first. You are not in the right mood. You will probably do a better job later. You should handle one smaller task before starting the important one. None of these thoughts necessarily sounds unreasonable. That is what makes delay so effective. It rarely asks you to abandon the responsibility completely. It only asks you to postpone the first movement. The longer you remain still, however, the more psychological weight the task can acquire. Starting immediately does not mean rushing into every responsibility without thought. It means recognizing when additional preparation has stopped being useful and has become another form of delay. There is a point at which planning improves performance, and there is another point at which planning protects you from having to experience the discomfort of beginning. Knowing the difference requires honesty. If you already understand what needs to be done, have the necessary resources, and are simply waiting to feel more willing, then more preparation may not be preparation at all. It may be resistance wearing a more respectable appearance. This becomes clear in ordinary situations. A person needs to make an important phone call, but spends 20 minutes deciding exactly what to say. Someone needs to write a report, but spends an hour choosing fonts, organizing folders, and reviewing notes that were already understood. A student needs to begin studying, but first cleans the desk, prepares a drink, checks messages, and searches for the perfect study method. These actions can create the feeling of progress because they are related to the task, but related is not the same as necessary. The decisive question is simple: what action actually moves the responsibility forward? Once you know the answer, that action deserves priority. Small, deliberate actions are powerful because they change the psychological state from anticipation to participation. Before you begin, your mind imagines the task as a complete experience. It sees the effort, uncertainty, boredom, and possible difficulty all at once. Once you begin, however, your attention becomes more specific. Instead of thinking about writing an entire report, you are writing the opening paragraph. Instead of imagining an entire workout, you are completing the first movement. Instead of worrying about an entire conversation, you are dialing the number. Specific action narrows the problem. The mind no longer has to manage an imagined future all at once. There is an important difference between making a task smaller and making it meaningless. If a responsibility genuinely requires 3 hours of concentrated work, pretending that 5 minutes will complete it is unrealistic. The purpose of a small first action is not to deny the size of the responsibility. It is to overcome the psychological barrier between intention and execution. 5 minutes can become the entry point into serious work. One paragraph can lead to another. One page can lead to deeper reading. One phone call can resolve an issue that has occupied your thoughts for days. The first action does not need to finish the responsibility. It needs to establish movement. This is particularly useful when perfectionism is involved. Perfectionism can appear ambitious because it demands high standards, but it can also create hesitation by making the first attempt feel too important. If you believe the first draft must already be excellent, starting becomes threatening. If you believe the first workout must be intense, exercising becomes harder to initiate. If you believe the first attempt at a new skill must prove your ability, being a beginner becomes uncomfortable. A deliberate first action changes the standard. The first objective becomes participation, not performance. Quality can be improved after something exists. Nothing can be improved before it has been created. The same principle applies to difficult conversations. Imagine that you have been avoiding a discussion with a colleague because you are uncertain about how the other person will react. You may spend days rehearsing possible responses. The conversation becomes larger in your imagination, while the actual opportunity to communicate remains untouched. A small deliberate action might be writing down the specific issue in one sentence, choosing an appropriate time to speak, or asking the person whether they have a few minutes to talk. None of these actions solves the entire problem, but each reduces uncertainty by replacing imagined scenarios with actual information. Immediate action also protects you from the influence of changing moods. If you wait until you feel completely ready, you allow your emotional state to determine when your responsibility begins. But emotions fluctuate for reasons that have little connection to what deserves to be done. You can wake up tired and still be capable of beginning. You can feel anxious and still send the email. You can feel bored and still read the first page. The objective is not to eliminate these feelings before acting. It is to stop requiring emotional permission for every necessary behavior. There is a useful distinction between urgency and immediacy. Not every task needs to be completed immediately. and treating everything as urgent creates unnecessary stress. But once you have deliberately chosen a time to act, there is value in beginning at that time rather than reopening the decision. If your study session starts at 7, 7 should mean beginning rather than deciding whether beginning is still appropriate. If your writing period begins at 8, the first few minutes should be spent writing rather than evaluating your motivation. A planned start time becomes meaningful only when it represents action. The physical movement associated with beginning can also matter. Standing up, opening the document, putting on the shoes, placing the book on the desk, or dialing the number may seem almost trivial. Yet these actions create a transition between intention and behavior. The mistake is to underestimate them because they are small. Discipline is built through repeated transitions. You are teaching yourself that when a responsibility reaches its appointed moment, you do not remain trapped in preparation. You move toward the task. Another practical technique is to define the first action before the moment when you need to perform it. If you wait until the starting time to decide what beginning means, you may create another opportunity for hesitation. Before going to bed, decide what the first study problem will be. Before ending your workday, identify the first action for tomorrow's major task. Before exercising, determine the first movement you will perform. This removes ambiguity. When the moment arrives, you are not searching for direction. You are following a decision already made under calmer conditions. Small actions also provide information. When you begin a task, you may discover that the difficulty was different from what you expected. Perhaps the problem was easier than imagined. Perhaps you lacked important information. Perhaps the project needs to be divided differently. Perhaps you are more tired than you realized and need to adjust your plan responsibly. Action produces evidence. Delay produces speculation. This is one reason starting matters so much. You cannot think your way into information that only experience can provide. Of course, immediate action should not become impulsive action. Some decisions deserve reflection. A financial commitment, a major career change, or a serious personal conversation may require careful consideration. Discipline does not mean acting quickly simply for the satisfaction of saying you acted. It means acting promptly once the necessary judgment has been completed. The skill is knowing when thinking has served its purpose. After the facts are sufficient and the decision is reasonable, continued hesitation often adds little value. You can begin practicing this today with one responsibility you have been postponing. Do not make a dramatic promise about becoming a completely different person. Identify the first concrete action that would count as genuine progress and perform it before doing anything unrelated. If the task takes an hour, give yourself permission to begin with the first 5 minutes. If the task requires a conversation, take the first communication step. If the task requires writing, produce the first imperfect paragraph. The point is not to trick yourself. It is to train yourself to respond to responsibility with movement rather than prolonged negotiation. Something changes when you repeatedly begin this way. You accumulate experiences in which the anticipated discomfort was greater than the actual discomfort. You learn that uncertainty often decreases after action. You discover that difficult tasks become clearer once you engage with them directly. Most importantly, you begin reducing the time between deciding and doing. That interval matters because it is where many excuses are created. The faster you can move from a clear decision to a deliberate first action, the less opportunity you give temporary resistance to reshape your priorities. Yet beginning is only one part of discipline. A person can start strongly and still abandon the responsibility when the initial enthusiasm disappears. The deeper test comes after the first action, when the task becomes repetitive, difficult, or emotionally unrewarding. At that point, you need something more dependable than the ability to start. You need a reason to continue when continuing feels unnecessary, and that requires learning how to keep the promises you make to yourself. Chapter 6. Strengthen consistency by keeping promises you make to yourself. There is a quiet difference between making a promise to someone else and making one to yourself. When another person depends on you, the consequences of breaking your word are often visible. Someone may be disappointed, a deadline may be missed, or a responsibility may remain unfinished. But when you disappoint yourself, the consequences can be much harder to notice. Nobody may know that you intended to exercise, study, save money, finish the project, or wake up early. You can simply change the explanation in your own mind and move forward. That private flexibility can become dangerous because your relationship with yourself is built through what you repeatedly do when nobody is watching. Consistency begins when your private commitments become as meaningful to you as the promises other people can hear. A promise to yourself does not need to be dramatic. In fact, many of the most important commitments are ordinary. You decide that you will read for 20 minutes each evening. You decide that you will stop working at a reasonable time instead of allowing every unfinished task to consume the night. You decide that you will practice a skill 3 times a week. You decide that you will prepare for tomorrow before going to sleep. These decisions may seem too small to matter, but they create evidence about whether your intentions can be trusted. Every time you follow through, you reinforce the connection between a decision and an action. Every time you casually abandon the commitment, you make it easier to treat your own future decisions as negotiable. This does not mean you should never change a commitment. Circumstances change, new information appears, priorities become clearer. A schedule that seemed reasonable can become unrealistic. Keeping every promise, regardless of changing conditions, is not discipline. It can become stubbornness. The important distinction is whether you are revising a commitment because thoughtful judgment requires it, or because the commitment has become inconvenient. If you decide to change your plan, do it consciously. Decide what replaces it and why. Do not simply allow the original promise to disappear. The act of deliberate revision preserves self-respect because you remain the person making the decision. Many people weaken their consistency by making promises that are far too large. They become frustrated with their current behavior and respond by creating an ideal version of themselves overnight. They promise to exercise every day, read an hour every night, eliminate every distraction, eat perfectly, wake before sunrise, and become completely productive. The emotional intensity of the moment makes the plan feel convincing. But when ordinary life returns, the standard becomes difficult to maintain. One missed day then feels like failure, and failure becomes an excuse to abandon the entire plan. A more reliable commitment is smaller, specific, and realistic enough to survive an ordinary week. The goal is not to impress yourself with the size of the promise. The goal is to become someone whose promises remain credible. Imagine a person who decides to practice a new language. On the first day, enthusiasm is high, so they study for 2 hours. On the second day, they manage 40 minutes. On the third day, they are busy and skip the session. By the end of the week, the entire plan has disappeared. The problem was not a lack of ability to learn. The problem was that the commitment was designed around enthusiasm rather than sustainability. A better promise might have been 15 focused minutes on most days, with longer sessions when time allows. That commitment may look less ambitious, but it creates continuity. Over several months, continuity produces more learning than occasional bursts, followed by long periods of inactivity. There is also a psychological effect that occurs when you repeatedly keep modest commitments. You begin to reduce the need for constant reassurance. You do not need to feel inspired before acting because you have previous evidence that you can follow through. This evidence changes your internal expectations. When you say, "I will do this after dinner," the statement carries more weight because you have practiced honoring similar decisions. Confidence becomes less dependent on positive thinking and more connected to observable behavior. You know what you can expect from yourself because your recent actions have made that expectation reasonable. The opposite pattern can develop quietly. Suppose you repeatedly tell yourself that you will go to the gym tomorrow, finish the report tonight, or stop spending unnecessarily next month. Each time you believe the promise when you make it. Each time you fail to follow through. Eventually, the problem is no longer the individual commitment. The problem is that your own words have lost credibility in your mind. You may still make ambitious plans, but some part of you no longer expects them to become actions. This creates hesitation before commitment because you have learnt that intention and behavior are often separate. Restoring that connection requires fewer promises and more completed ones. One practical way to strengthen this connection is to make commitments measurable. "I will become healthier" is an aspiration, not a clear promise. "I will walk for 20 minutes after dinner on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday" gives the commitment a definite form. "I will work harder" is vague. "I will spend 30 focused minutes on the most important project before checking entertainment" is observable. Clarity matters because an unclear promise can always be interpreted generously after the fact. A precise commitment allows you to evaluate your behavior without unnecessary argument. You either followed it, adjusted it deliberately, or did not. You should also pay attention to how quickly you negotiate with yourself. The moment a commitment becomes inconvenient, the mind may begin proposing alternatives. "You can do it tomorrow. You have already worked hard this week. One exception will not matter. You deserve a break." Sometimes these statements are valid, but if you hear them repeatedly at the exact moment responsibility becomes uncomfortable, recognize the pattern. You do not need to debate every thought. Ask whether the original commitment is still reasonable. If it is, follow through. The less unnecessary negotiation you engage in, the stronger your consistency becomes. Keeping promises to yourself also requires learning how to recover without self-punishment. Suppose you planned to study 4 evenings but completed only 3. You can respond by deciding that the entire week was wasted, or you can examine what happened and return to the commitment. Excessive self-criticism often consumes the same energy needed for correction. Responsibility is more useful than shame. If you made a poor decision, acknowledge it accurately. If your plan was unrealistic, revise it. If you simply chose comfort over responsibility, admit that without exaggeration and make the next decision better. The objective is not to maintain a perfect record. It is to maintain an honest relationship with your own behavior. There is a deeper reason this matters. Your future self has no ability to act today. Only the present version of you can make choices that affect what comes later. When you keep a reasonable commitment, you are accepting responsibility for a person who does not yet have a voice in the current moment. The person who will face tomorrow's deadline, next month's financial situation, or next year's consequences cannot negotiate with you today. You have to decide whether the comfort of the present moment deserves more authority than the needs of the future. Discipline often means choosing to protect that future, even when there is no immediate reward for doing so. This becomes particularly meaningful in private situations. You may have promised yourself that you would stop wasting evenings, reduce unnecessary spending, finish a course, organize your responsibilities, or make time for something important. Nobody else may ever know whether you followed through. That privacy makes the choice more significant, not less. When there is no external praise or punishment, your behavior reveals what standards you actually live by. You begin to understand that integrity is not only about how you behave when others are observing. It is also about whether your actions remain consistent with your own stated values when there is no audience. Over time, this consistency changes the way you experience difficult responsibilities. A task may still be unpleasant, but it no longer creates the same internal uncertainty. You have developed a history of following through. That history becomes a quiet source of stability. You do not need to convince yourself that you are disciplined. Your behavior provides the evidence. And because the evidence comes from repeated ordinary actions, it is more durable than temporary confidence. But there is a limit to what consistency can accomplish if you continue expecting yourself to perform perfectly under every emotional condition. Eventually, life will present a day when you are frustrated, disappointed, tired, or emotionally unsettled. Your commitment may remain intact, but your ability to execute it will be affected by what you are feeling. The next challenge is therefore more demanding than simply keeping a schedule. It is learning how to act responsibly while strong emotions are present, without allowing those emotions to take control of your behavior. Chapter 7. Manage emotional resistance without allowing feelings to dictate your behavior. A difficult emotion can make a reasonable decision feel unreasonable within seconds. You can receive criticism and immediately want to defend yourself. You can feel rejected and suddenly decide that the relationship is not worth maintaining. You can become frustrated at work and start imagining a different career. You can feel overwhelmed by your responsibilities and begin telling yourself that everything needs to change. The intensity of the feeling creates pressure to act, but the pressure itself is not evidence that action is required. One of the most demanding forms of discipline is learning to experience an emotion fully without allowing it to become the person making your decisions. Emotional self-control is often misunderstood as suppressing feelings. That approach usually creates another problem because ignored emotions do not simply disappear. They can return through irritability, withdrawal, impulsive behavior, or exhaustion. Real self-control begins with recognition. You notice the anger before sending the message. You notice the disappointment before making a permanent judgment. You notice the fear before abandoning an important responsibility. You do not need to argue with the emotion or convince yourself that it is wrong. You simply recognize that an emotional reaction is information about your current internal state, not automatically a command about what you should do next. Consider what happens after receiving harsh criticism. Your first response may be defensive because criticism can threaten your sense of competence. The mind quickly searches for evidence that the other person is unfair, uninformed, or unreasonable. Sometimes that assessment will be correct. But if you respond while anger is at its highest intensity, you may say something that creates consequences far larger than the original criticism. A disciplined response begins by creating distance between the event and the reaction. You can acknowledge that the comment affected you, wait until the emotional intensity decreases, and then examine what was actually said. Perhaps there was useful information mixed with poor delivery. Perhaps the criticism was inaccurate. Perhaps you contributed to the problem. Clear judgment becomes easier when you are no longer trying to protect your pride in the same moment. Emotions also distort the perception of time. When you feel discouraged, the present difficulty can seem permanent. A difficult week begins to feel like evidence that your entire effort is failing. When you feel anxious, a future possibility can feel almost certain. When you feel angry, immediate action can seem more important than long-term consequences. This is why emotional discipline requires a broader time perspective. Ask what this situation is likely to look like after a day, a month, or a year. The question does not make the emotion disappear. It gives the emotion a more accurate place within the larger situation. This becomes especially important during periods of disappointment. Imagine that you have worked toward a professional opportunity and someone else receives it. The emotional response may include frustration, embarrassment, jealousy, or self-doubt. Your mind may immediately offer conclusions. You are not good enough, the effort was pointless, or there is no reason to try again. Those thoughts may feel convincing because they are attached to a painful event, but an outcome and an identity are not the same thing. You can accept disappointment without turning it into a judgment about your entire capacity. The disciplined question is not, how do I make myself feel positive? It is, what does this result actually tell me, and what remains under my control? That question returns responsibility to the present. You may not control whether someone chooses you for an opportunity, how another person behaves, or whether an unexpected event changes your plans. You can control whether you examine the result honestly, improve what can be improved, and continue acting according to your values. This is where a Stoic perspective becomes practical rather than philosophical. Control is not about controlling every external event. It is about distinguishing your responsibility from what belongs to circumstances, other people, and chance. Emotional resistance becomes easier to manage when you stop demanding that reality produce the outcome you wanted before you allow yourself to act with composure. There are also emotions that arise from comparison. You see someone else's progress and suddenly feel behind. You hear about another person's success and begin questioning your own decisions. You notice someone who appears more disciplined, wealthy, confident, or accomplished, and experience dissatisfaction with your current position. Comparison can create an urgent desire to change direction without enough thought. You may abandon a reasonable plan simply because another person's results have made your own progress feel inadequate. Emotional discipline means recognizing the feeling without allowing another person's life to rewrite your priorities. Their progress may provide useful information, but it does not automatically define what your life requires. Another common challenge is emotional fatigue. When you have been responsible for many things for a long time, even ordinary demands can begin to feel irritating. You may become impatient with people you normally care about. You may resent tasks that you previously accepted without difficulty. You may want to withdraw from everything simply because your internal resources are depleted. In such moments, discipline does not mean forcing maximum performance. It means responding intelligently to the condition you are actually in. Perhaps you need sleep, food, movement, quiet, or a temporary reduction in unnecessary commitments. Rest can be a responsible action when it restores your ability to function. The important distinction is whether you are recovering so that you can return to responsibility or avoiding responsibility indefinitely. You can develop emotional awareness by becoming more precise about what you feel. Saying, "I feel bad," provides little useful information. Are you embarrassed, angry, lonely, overwhelmed, disappointed, threatened, bored, resentful? Naming the emotion more accurately can reduce confusion because different emotions create different impulses. Anger may push you toward confrontation. Fear may push you toward withdrawal. Shame may push you toward hiding. Boredom may push you toward stimulation. Once you identify the impulse, you have a better chance of deciding whether following it would actually serve your values. A useful practice is to delay important decisions when emotional intensity is unusually high. This does not mean avoiding decisions forever. It means recognizing that some moments are better for observation than judgment. If you are furious, do not send the message that could damage a relationship. If you are deeply discouraged, do not immediately abandon the goal. If you are extremely excited, do not make an expensive commitment simply because the opportunity feels irresistible. Give the emotional state time to settle, then reconsider the decision. A delay of several hours can sometimes reveal that what felt urgent was actually temporary. This principle also applies to positive emotions. Discipline is not only protection against anger and fear. Excitement can weaken judgment just as easily. A sudden opportunity may cause you to overcommit. Praise may make you accept responsibilities you cannot realistically manage. Confidence may cause you to underestimate preparation. Emotional maturity means remaining capable of judgment even when the feeling is pleasant. You do not need to distrust positive emotions. You simply refuse to treat emotional intensity as proof that a decision is correct. The strongest form of emotional self-control appears when your feelings disagree with your values. You may feel like withdrawing when courage requires participation. You may feel like retaliating when restraint would protect the relationship. You may feel like quitting when responsibility requires another attempt. You may feel like spending when your larger goal requires patience. In these moments, discipline becomes a choice between the immediate expression of emotion and the longer-term preservation of what matters. You are not denying the emotion. You are deciding that it will be heard without being placed in charge. This ability grows through practice in ordinary situations. You do not need to wait for a major crisis. Notice the urge to interrupt someone and wait before speaking. Notice irritation while driving and choose not to escalate it. Notice the desire to check your phone during a difficult task and remain with the responsibility. Notice disappointment after a mistake and resist the urge to attack yourself. Each moment gives you an opportunity to experience an impulse without immediately converting it into behavior. Over time, that separation becomes more natural. You begin discovering that an urge can be strong without being binding. There is also freedom in realizing that you do not have to resolve every emotion immediately. Some feelings need to be understood gradually. You can be disappointed without deciding what the disappointment means about your future. You can be angry without deciding who is permanently against you. You can be uncertain without forcing an immediate conclusion. The demand to resolve every uncomfortable feeling quickly often creates unnecessary decisions. Sometimes the most disciplined response is to remain steady while the emotional experience changes on its own. Eventually, emotional self-control becomes less about resisting feelings and more about developing confidence in your ability to carry them. You learn that anxiety can exist while you act responsibly. Frustration can exist while you remain respectful. Disappointment can exist while you continue working. Fatigue can exist while you make reasonable adjustments. The presence of an emotion no longer determines the quality of your behavior. That is a deeper form of resilience because life will continue producing situations you cannot control, but your response becomes less dependent on how comfortable you feel. Yet, there is another challenge waiting beneath emotional resistance. Sometimes the problem is not a sudden emotional reaction. Sometimes the discomfort comes from having to continue doing something long after the initial excitement has disappeared. Boredom, repetition, frustration, and delayed rewards can test discipline in a slower and more persistent way. Learning to manage strong emotions gives you control in difficult moments, but lasting progress requires something further: the ability to remain engaged when nothing about the task feels rewarding. That is where your tolerance for discomfort begins to determine the strength of your discipline. Chapter 8. Increase your tolerance for boredom, frustration, and delayed rewards. There is a particular kind of difficulty that appears when nothing is happening. No crisis is forcing you forward. No deadline is close enough to create urgency. Nobody is watching. The work is repetitive. The results are distant, and the activity provides very little immediate satisfaction. This is where many people discover that they were not only depending on motivation, they were depending on stimulation. When the task becomes boring, they look for something more interesting. When progress becomes slow, they search for faster results. When success requires months instead of days, they begin questioning whether the effort is worth continuing. The ability to tolerate these ordinary forms of discomfort is one of the foundations of serious discipline, because much of meaningful progress is not emotionally exciting while it is happening. Boredom is not necessarily evidence that an activity lacks value. Often, it simply means the brain has become familiar with the activity and is receiving less novelty from it. A person can understand this intellectually and still struggle with it emotionally. Reading the same subject for several weeks may become less stimulating. Practicing a skill can feel repetitive. Strength training can involve movements that are technically simple but mentally uninteresting. Saving money can become frustrating because the reward exists in a future that cannot be experienced today. When immediate stimulation decreases, the mind naturally searches for alternatives. Discipline becomes the ability to remain engaged with a worthwhile activity, even when the activity stops entertaining you. Consider someone learning a difficult professional skill. During the first few weeks, every improvement feels noticeable. New concepts create excitement because progress is obvious. Eventually, improvement becomes harder to detect. The person practices the same fundamental techniques and begins wondering whether anything is changing. This is often the point at which people quit. They interpret the absence of visible progress as evidence that the effort has stopped producing results. But development does not always occur at a rate that can be felt from one session to the next. Sometimes the value of repeated practice becomes visible only after enough experience has accumulated. If you demand frequent emotional confirmation that your effort is working, you may stop before the results have had time to appear. Delayed rewards create a similar psychological problem. The human mind tends to value immediate outcomes more strongly than distant ones, even when the distant outcome is objectively more important. Eating something enjoyable produces an immediate experience. Improving your health takes time. Spending money produces an immediate purchase. Building financial security takes repeated restraint. Watching entertainment provides immediate stimulation. Developing expertise requires sustained attention before the benefits become obvious. The future reward is real, but it lacks the emotional intensity of the present reward. Discipline requires you to make decisions using more than the strongest feeling available at the moment. This does not mean rejecting pleasure. A disciplined life is not supposed to be joyless. The problem begins when immediate pleasure consistently controls decisions that carry long-term consequences. If you always choose what feels rewarding now, you eventually become less capable of choosing what matters later. The skill is not eliminating immediate rewards, but learning to place them in the correct position. You can enjoy entertainment after completing important work. You can spend some money while still protecting your financial priorities. You can rest without turning rest into indefinite avoidance. When pleasure becomes something you choose rather than something that automatically interrupts responsibility, your relationship with it changes. One useful way to strengthen tolerance is to stop expecting every valuable activity to feel satisfying while you are doing it. Some responsibilities are satisfying afterward rather than during the process. Cleaning a difficult space may not be enjoyable while you are doing it, but finishing can create relief. Studying may feel mentally demanding, but understanding a difficult concept can create genuine satisfaction later. Administrative work may be dull, yet completing it removes a source of future stress. The absence of enjoyment during the process does not make the process meaningless. Sometimes the reward is simply knowing that the responsibility has been handled. Frustration requires a different kind of endurance. Boredom asks you to remain engaged when stimulation is low. Frustration asks you to continue when your efforts are producing mistakes or resistance. A person learning to play an instrument may repeat the same difficult passage many times. Someone learning a new software system may repeatedly make errors. A business owner may face several failed attempts before discovering what works. Frustration creates the temptation to conclude that the difficulty itself is evidence of incompetence. But difficulty can also reveal where further practice is required. The disciplined response is not blind persistence, it is curiosity about the source of the problem. Suppose you are studying a difficult subject and repeatedly make the same type of mistake. Continuing to solve problems in exactly the same way may only reinforce the problem. Tolerance for frustration should therefore include the ability to pause, examine the error, seek better information, and try again. Persistence without reflection can become wasteful. Reflection without continued effort can become another form of avoidance. Productive discipline combines both. You remain engaged long enough to learn from difficulty instead of using difficulty as a reason to leave. There is also a social dimension to delayed gratification. You may see other people receiving quick recognition while your own progress remains private. Someone else may appear to advance faster in a career, build an audience more quickly, or reach a financial goal sooner. This can create impatience with your own pace. You may begin changing strategies repeatedly because you want evidence that your effort is producing visible results. Constantly changing direction can prevent any single approach from receiving enough time to work. Patience does not mean refusing to adapt. It means allowing a reasonable process enough time to produce information before abandoning it. Your environment can make tolerance easier or harder. If you constantly consume highly stimulating content, ordinary activities may begin to feel unusually dull by comparison. A few minutes of quiet reading can feel difficult after spending hours switching between rapidly changing sources of entertainment. This does not mean all entertainment is harmful. It means frequent stimulation can influence your expectations about how quickly your attention should be rewarded. Reducing unnecessary stimulation can make ordinary tasks feel more manageable because your mind has fewer reasons to demand constant novelty. You can practice this by deliberately spending short periods doing one worthwhile activity without switching. Read without checking your phone. Walk without listening to constant entertainment. Eat a meal without watching another screen. Work on one problem without moving to another simply because the first one became difficult. These periods may initially feel uncomfortable. That discomfort is useful information. You are discovering how accustomed your attention has become to immediate stimulation. The objective is not to make boredom disappear. It is to become capable of remaining present without needing to escape it immediately. Another important skill is learning to distinguish boredom from exhaustion. If you are physically or mentally depleted, forcing yourself to continue indefinitely may reduce the quality of your work and damage recovery. Discipline requires judgment. Sometimes the responsible action is to continue through mild boredom. At other times, the responsible action is to stop because your capacity has genuinely been exceeded. The distinction can be difficult because both conditions can create a desire to quit. You have to examine your state rather than automatically choosing either relentless effort or immediate rest. Sustainable discipline includes knowing when discomfort is productive and when recovery is necessary. Delayed rewards also become easier to tolerate when you measure the process rather than constantly measuring the outcome. If your only question is whether you have achieved the final goal, many days will appear unsuccessful. Instead, measure behaviors you can control. Did you practice? Did you complete the planned session? Did you save the intended amount? Did you follow the training schedule? Did you spend focused time developing the skill? These measures do not guarantee success, but they provide accurate feedback about whether you are performing the actions that make success possible. The process gives you something concrete to evaluate, while the final result remains uncertain. This approach also protects you from emotional overreaction. If a week produces little visible progress, you do not need to declare the entire effort useless. You can examine whether the process was followed and whether the strategy needs adjustment. If you followed the process consistently, the absence of immediate results may simply mean more time is required. If you did not follow it, the answer may be to improve consistency rather than abandon the goal. Either way, the decision becomes more rational because you are evaluating evidence instead of reacting to impatience. There is a quiet strength that develops when you become comfortable with ordinary effort. You no longer require every day to feel productive in an emotional sense. You can complete repetitive work without needing constant excitement. You can practice without immediate praise. You can wait for results without assuming that waiting means failure. You become less vulnerable to the pressure for everything to happen quickly. This changes the quality of your decisions because you can evaluate actions according to their usefulness rather than their ability to produce immediate satisfaction. The deeper lesson is that tolerance can be trained. You are not permanently assigned a fixed capacity for boredom, frustration, or delayed rewards. Every time you remain with a worthwhile activity a little longer, resist unnecessary stimulation, or continue thoughtfully after an imperfect result, you strengthen that capacity. The change may be subtle, but it affects what kinds of responsibilities you are capable of carrying. A person who can tolerate only immediate rewards will naturally choose different goals from someone who can remain committed through long periods of uncertainty. Eventually, however, tolerance alone is not enough. You can become very good at enduring discomfort while still failing to protect your larger standards. There will be situations where quitting is reasonable, but there will also be moments when circumstances make quitting feel reasonable, even though the responsibility remains. The next stage of discipline requires a more difficult judgment, learning how to maintain your standards when pressure, inconvenience, and disappointment give you convincing reasons to lower them. Chapter 9. Apply disciplined standards when circumstances make quitting feel reasonable. There are moments when quitting feels completely reasonable. You have been working for months, and the results are still smaller than expected. You followed the plan, but circumstances changed. Someone you depended on failed to do their part. An unexpected expense disrupted your progress. A difficult project became more demanding than you anticipated. Your energy is lower than it was when you started, and continuing requires another decision to give more of yourself. In these moments, discipline is not about pretending everything is fine. It is about deciding whether the circumstances have genuinely changed what is reasonable, or whether they have simply made the responsibility harder. That distinction matters because difficulty can make a lower standard feel justified, even when the original standard remains appropriate. A disciplined standard is not an unrealistic demand for perfect performance. It is a clear expectation about how you intend to behave when conditions become inconvenient. Anyone can make a commitment when everything is comfortable. The more revealing moment arrives when the schedule changes, the outcome disappoints you, or the effort becomes more expensive than expected. This is where standards are tested. If your principles disappear whenever circumstances become uncomfortable, they were preferences rather than standards. A standard becomes meaningful when it continues to guide behavior after the emotional reward has disappeared. Imagine a person who decides to improve their financial situation by saving a fixed amount each month. Then an unexpected expense arrives. The person cannot save the full amount without creating another serious problem. Maintaining the original number would be irresponsible. But abandoning the entire financial plan would also be unnecessary. The disciplined response might be to save a smaller amount temporarily, reduce another expense, and return to the original target when circumstances stabilize. The standard has not disappeared. The method has changed because reality required an adjustment. This is different from using one unexpected expense as permission to stop managing money altogether. The ability to distinguish adjustment from surrender requires clear standards before pressure arrives. If you have not decided what matters, every difficult situation becomes an argument you must solve emotionally. But if you know the principle you are protecting, decisions become easier. You may not always be able to complete everything, but you can decide what must not be abandoned. A professional may not finish every task during an unusually difficult week, but they can still protect honesty, communication, and the most important responsibility. A person pursuing better health may miss a planned workout because of illness, but they can still protect the broader commitment by recovering properly and returning when appropriate. Standards provide direction when circumstances prevent perfect execution. One reason people lower their standards too quickly is that discomfort changes the way they evaluate fairness. When you are tired, a reasonable expectation can suddenly feel excessive. When you are disappointed, ordinary effort can feel pointless. When you have already made several sacrifices, another sacrifice can feel unfair. The mind naturally considers the cost already paid, but the fact that something has become difficult does not automatically mean that continuing is wrong. You have to ask whether the difficulty has changed the value of the goal or simply changed the price of pursuing it. Those are very different questions. Consider someone who has spent several months studying for a professional examination. The person fails the first attempt by a small margin. The disappointment is real, and the temptation to quit is understandable. But the result itself does not answer whether continuing is sensible. The person needs to examine the evidence. Was the goal still valuable? Was the preparation strategy effective? What caused the weak areas? Are the financial and time costs still acceptable? Could the next attempt be approached differently? If the answers support another attempt, quitting solely because the first outcome was painful would allow disappointment to make the decision. Discipline asks for something harder. Evaluate the result without allowing the result to dictate the conclusion. There are also situations where continuing is no longer responsible. A plan can become financially destructive. A commitment can become incompatible with a necessary family responsibility. New evidence can reveal that the original objective was based on a misunderstanding. A strategy can repeatedly fail despite thoughtful adjustments. In such cases, changing direction is not weakness, it is judgment. The disciplined person does not remain loyal to a goal simply because they once committed to it. They remain loyal to reason, responsibility, and clearly chosen values. Sometimes the strongest decision is to continue. Sometimes it is to stop. The important question is why. This is why standards should be connected to principles rather than outcomes. You cannot guarantee that your work will succeed, that another person will appreciate your effort, or that a plan will produce the result you expected. You can control whether you prepare honestly, communicate clearly, keep your commitments, learn from mistakes, and respond responsibly to setbacks. When your standard depends entirely on success, failure can destroy your motivation. When your standard depends on how you behave while pursuing something worthwhile, failure becomes information rather than a final judgment. A useful test during difficult periods is to ask yourself what you would advise someone else in the same situation. Distance often improves judgment. If a friend told you that they had missed one deadline after months of consistent effort, You probably would not tell them that their entire character had failed. You would examine what happened and help them decide what to change. Yet people often apply much harsher standards to themselves because disappointment makes their own situation feel uniquely significant. Asking what you would reasonably recommend to another person can expose emotional exaggeration and bring the decision back toward fairness. Another important question is whether you are protecting your standard or protecting your pride. These can look similar from the outside. Someone may insist on continuing because they refuse to admit that the original plan was flawed. Another person may quit because continuing would require admitting that they need to change their approach. Both decisions can be driven by ego rather than judgment. Discipline requires enough humility to revise methods without abandoning principles. You can say, "This approach is not working," without saying, "Therefore I am incapable." You can also say, "This is difficult, but still worth doing," without pretending that your current method is perfect. Pressure often reveals whether your standards were based on values or appearances. Someone may maintain an impressive schedule because they want to see themselves as disciplined. When the schedule becomes inconvenient, the entire structure collapses because its real purpose was identity protection. A more durable standard asks simpler questions. Did I do what mattered? Did I handle my responsibilities honestly? Did I make reasonable use of the resources available to me? Did I respond to the setback without creating additional damage? These questions remain useful even when circumstances prevent an ideal performance. There is a practical way to strengthen this ability. When something disrupts your plan, do not immediately rewrite the entire plan. First, identify what changed. Then determine which parts of the original commitment are still possible. Protect those parts. Adjust what genuinely needs adjustment. Finally, decide when you will reassess the situation. This prevents temporary disruption from becoming permanent abandonment. It also prevents rigid thinking because you are allowing reality to influence your actions without allowing reality to erase your standards. Imagine a person training for a long-term physical goal who develops a temporary limitation that prevents their normal routine. The wrong response could be to force the original routine and create greater damage. Another wrong response could be to stop all activity indefinitely because the original plan is no longer possible. A disciplined response would identify what can still be done safely, maintain the broader objective, and modify the process until normal training becomes appropriate again. The standard is not "never change the plan." The standard is "do not abandon responsible action simply because the original method became unavailable." The same principle applies to work, relationships, education, finances, and personal commitments. Life will repeatedly create conditions that you did not choose. Sometimes the obstacle will be small. Sometimes it will require serious adaptation. Your discipline is measured partly by how accurately you respond. A rigid person treats every change as a threat to the plan. A careless person treats every change as permission to abandon the plan. A disciplined person asks what reality requires now while preserving what still matters. There is also a quiet dignity in maintaining standards when nobody rewards you for doing so. You may complete the responsible action and receive no praise. You may continue preparing even when success is uncertain. You may choose restraint while nobody knows what you gave up. These moments matter because they separate discipline from performance. You are not maintaining a standard to create an image. You are maintaining it because you have decided that the way you behave under pressure is part of the person you want to become. Eventually, this way of thinking changes how setbacks feel. They may still hurt, but they no longer automatically threaten your direction. You become more capable of saying, "This is harder than expected," without immediately adding, "Therefore I should stop." You can recognize genuine limits without using every limitation as an excuse. You can adjust without becoming inconsistent. You can continue without becoming rigid. That balance is one of the clearest signs that discipline has become more than a temporary effort. But there is one final question that remains. What happens when you have built routines, protected your attention, started difficult tasks, kept your commitments, managed your emotions, tolerated slow progress, and maintained reasonable standards, yet the process has become so familiar that discipline itself begins to feel like part of who you are? At that point, the challenge is no longer simply continuing the behavior. It is turning disciplined action into a stable identity that remains present even when circumstances change, goals evolve, and nobody is there to remind you who you intended to become. Chapter 10. Transform disciplined actions into an identity built around personal responsibility. At some point, discipline stops being something you practice and becomes something you expect from yourself. You no longer need to announce that you are trying to become more disciplined. You simply begin making decisions differently. You prepare before you are forced to. You finish responsibilities that are not exciting. You consider consequences before acting. You correct yourself without waiting for someone else to do it. The important change is not that difficult actions have suddenly become easy. It is that your behavior is no longer completely dependent on how you feel in the moment. You have developed a personal standard, and that standard begins influencing your choices even when nobody is watching. Identity is built through repeated evidence. You cannot simply declare yourself disciplined and expect your behavior to follow automatically. If you repeatedly tell yourself that you are reliable but regularly ignore commitments, your actions will eventually challenge the statement. The mind pays attention to what happens repeatedly. When you make a reasonable commitment and honor it, you provide evidence that your intentions have weight. When you make excuses every time something becomes uncomfortable, you provide different evidence. This is why identity should be treated as the result of behavior rather than a replacement for it. You become more responsible by repeatedly acting responsibly. This matters because identity influences future decisions. A person who sees themselves as someone who handles responsibilities begins to notice choices differently. When an important task appears, the first question is less likely to be whether they feel like doing it, and more likely to be how they will handle it. When they make a mistake, they are more likely to correct it because correction fits the person they are becoming. When circumstances become inconvenient, they do not automatically interpret inconvenience as permission to abandon their standards. Their self-concept begins supporting the behavior instead of constantly fighting against it. But there is a danger in turning identity into a rigid image. If you become attached to the idea that you are always disciplined, you may begin hiding mistakes because they threaten that image. You may refuse to admit exhaustion, change an outdated goal, or ask for help because you believe responsible people should handle everything alone. That is not maturity. A strong identity must have enough flexibility to include correction. You can be responsible and still make poor decisions. You can be disciplined and still have an unproductive day. You can value self-control and still experience moments when emotion affects your behavior. The identity becomes durable when it is based on returning to your principles rather than maintaining an illusion of perfection. Personal responsibility begins with accepting ownership over choices without claiming ownership over everything. You cannot control another person's behavior, the economy, unexpected events, or every consequence of your decisions. But you can control whether you prepare, communicate, learn, adapt, and respond honestly. This distinction prevents responsibility from becoming self-blame. If something goes wrong, the useful question is not always, "How was this my fault?" A better question is, what part of this situation belongs to me? Perhaps you made the decision, perhaps you failed to prepare, perhaps you could have communicated earlier, perhaps nothing about the event was within your control, but your response remains your responsibility. This way of thinking creates accountability without unnecessary guilt. Imagine that you miss an important deadline because you underestimated how long the project would take. An irresponsible response would blame the deadline, the workload, or other people without examining your own choices. An equally unhelpful response would attack yourself and decide that you are incapable. A responsible response would identify the actual error, determine what caused the inaccurate estimate, and change the planning process. You are not trying to punish yourself for the mistake. You are trying to become less likely to repeat it. Responsibility becomes practical when every failure creates a specific lesson rather than a general judgment about your worth. The same principle applies to relationships. A responsible person does not assume that every conflict is entirely their fault, but they also do not automatically make the other person responsible for everything that went wrong. They examine their own behavior honestly. Did they communicate clearly? Did they listen? Did they avoid a necessary conversation? Did they react defensively? Did they make an assumption instead of asking a question? These questions can be uncomfortable because they require humility, but they also create the possibility of improvement. Personal responsibility is not about carrying every burden. It is about refusing to abandon the part that genuinely belongs to you. There is another important shift that occurs when discipline becomes part of identity. You begin caring more about standards than moods. You still have emotions, preferences, and personal desires, but they become one source of information rather than the final authority. If you feel tired, you consider whether rest is necessary. If you feel frustrated, you consider what needs to change. If you feel tempted, you consider the consequence. If you feel bored, you decide whether the activity still serves a worthwhile purpose. The emotion is present, but the decision comes from a broader evaluation. This is what self-control looks like when it becomes integrated into ordinary life. Your standards should also become visible in the small areas that nobody considers impressive. Returning something you borrowed, arriving when you said you would, completing a task before promising another one, admitting when you do not know something, paying attention when someone is speaking, cleaning up after yourself, preparing for a responsibility before it becomes urgent. These actions may not produce dramatic results, but they create a pattern of reliability. Character is often revealed through behaviors that seem too ordinary to deserve attention. Those ordinary behaviors are important precisely because they occur frequently. Over time, responsibility also changes how you think about freedom. At first, discipline can feel restrictive because it requires you to say no to certain impulses, but greater self-control can create more meaningful choices. If you manage your time, you have more control over where your attention goes. If you manage your money, you have more options when circumstances change. If you develop useful skills, you have greater freedom in your work. If you maintain your health responsibly, you protect future physical capacity. Discipline does not guarantee freedom from difficulty. It increases your ability to respond to difficulty without being completely controlled by it. This is why the ultimate purpose of discipline is not simply productivity. A person can become highly productive while remaining irresponsible, anxious, dishonest, or disconnected from what matters. Discipline should serve a larger way of living. It should help you become more dependable, more deliberate, more capable of carrying responsibility, and more willing to accept consequences without unnecessary complaint. The value of doing what you do not want to do is not that unpleasant tasks are inherently virtuous. The value is that you become capable of acting according to chosen principles, even when comfort points elsewhere. There will still be days when you fail. You may procrastinate. You may lose your temper. You may choose entertainment when you should have worked. You may break a commitment, underestimate a responsibility, or react emotionally. The mature response is not to pretend those failures do not matter. They do matter because behavior has consequences, but neither should you allow one failure to define the entire identity you are building. Examine it honestly, repair what can be repaired, change what needs changing, then return to the standard. Every return is another piece of evidence about the person you are becoming. Eventually, the most useful question changes from "How can I force myself to be disciplined?" to "What kind of person do I want my repeated choices to reveal?" That question is more demanding because it moves discipline beyond individual tasks. It asks you to consider your entire pattern of behavior. How do you respond when nobody is watching? What do you do when a commitment becomes inconvenient? How do you behave after failure? How do you treat responsibilities that offer no immediate reward? How honestly do you evaluate your own decisions? Your answers are not found in what you say about yourself. They are found in what you repeatedly do. A responsible identity also allows room for rest, pleasure, relationships, curiosity, and change. Discipline is not the elimination of everything enjoyable. It is the ability to choose enjoyment without allowing it to control every decision. You can take a day off without abandoning your standards. You can change direction without becoming unreliable. You can admit that a goal no longer matters without calling yourself a failure. You can work intensely and still recognize the need for recovery. The deeper discipline is not rigid control over every part of life. It is maintaining enough self-command to decide deliberately how your time, energy, and attention should be used. Perhaps the greatest evidence that discipline has become part of your identity is that you stop needing to think about it constantly. You simply handle what needs to be handled. You notice when you are avoiding something and correct course. You make fewer promises but take them more seriously. You understand that feelings can influence behavior without having to control it. You recognize that circumstances can require adjustment without requiring surrender. You become less interested in appearing disciplined and more interested in being dependable. The process becomes quieter because the argument inside your mind becomes less important than the action itself. And this brings the journey to a deeper conclusion. The discipline to do what you do not want to do was never really about forcing yourself to enjoy difficult things. It was about becoming capable of choosing responsibly when comfort, emotion, distraction, impatience, and uncertainty offered easier alternatives. You began by examining resistance. You learned to distinguish discomfort from danger, built structures that supported action, protected your attention, started before hesitation grew, kept commitments, managed emotional reactions, tolerated slow progress, maintained standards under pressure, and finally turned those behaviors into evidence of personal responsibility. But life will continue changing after this chapter ends. New responsibilities will appear. Old goals may lose their meaning. Unexpected losses will challenge your composure. Your discipline will not be proven by whether you can follow one perfect system forever. It will be proven by whether you can continue making thoughtful choices when the circumstances require you to become a different version of yourself.